Moving into my first apartment felt like a step toward true independence. At 22 years old, I was finally out of shared dorms, away from noisy roommates, and free to live on my own terms. The apartment wasn't perfect. It was a small one-bedroom unit tucked away in the suburbs of Boston at the very end of a narrow, dimly lit alleyway. But it was affordable, and after months of searching, I was eager to settle in. The building itself was old, probably built sometime in the early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors and pipes that groaned whenever the water ran. The walls were thin, and I could already hear the faint murmurs of a television from the apartment next door. Still, it had its charm: large windows, a modest but functional kitchen, and a small back door that led out to the alley. I hadn't thought much about that door. Not until I met the landlord. Mr. Callahan was an older man, somewhere in his 60s, with hollowed-out cheeks and a face that looked like it had endured one too many harsh winters. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against pavement, and his demeanor was one of quiet unease. As he handed me the keys, his fingers lingered just a second too long, as if reluctant to let go. "One thing," he muttered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That back door in the kitchen, don't open it at night, especially when it rains." I blinked, taken aback. "What?" His expression remained tight, serious, his gaze flickering toward the alleyway as if expecting something or someone to be standing there. "Just trust me," he said. "Keep it locked." Before I could ask anything else, he turned and walked off, his hunched figure disappearing into the misty evening air. I stood there for a moment, his words unsettling me in a way I couldn't explain. It was probably nothing. Maybe the lock was faulty, or maybe the stairs outside were unstable and he didn't want me falling in the dark. Brushing off the weird exchange, I spent the evening unpacking, filling the empty space with my belongings. Outside, the first droplets of rain began tapping against the windows. By the time night fully settled, the drizzle had turned into a steady downpour, the wind howling through the narrow alley like a ghost searching for a way in. I double-checked the front door. Then, as an afterthought, I walked to the kitchen and tested the back door handle. It was locked. Satisfied, I shut off the lights and headed to bed, letting the sound of the rain lull me into a sense of comfort. But in the quiet stillness of the night, Callahan's words lingered in the back of my mind, like a quiet whisper I should have listened to. Because before the night was over, I'd realized that he had been right. The rain hadn't stopped. It had been falling for hours, filling the night with a rhythmic tap-tap-tap against the windows. Normally, it was a comforting sound, something that helped me sleep. But that night, it wasn't. I wasn't sure what woke me. The wind? A stray creak from the old floorboards? Or maybe just the unfamiliar stillness of the apartment. I turned over, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. I went completely still. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I swallowed hard, listening. The storm outside hadn't let up, the wind occasionally howling through the alleyway behind the building. But the knocking stood out, clear, intentional. And it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back door in the kitchen, the one Callahan had warned me about. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to ignore it. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind. But then, knock, knock, knock. Same rhythm, same perfect, steady pace. My stomach twisted into knots. I knew I had locked the door. I knew I had checked it before bed. Hadn't I? I forced myself to move, throwing the blankets off and setting my feet on the floor. The air inside the apartment felt wrong, heavy, like the space around me had somehow shrunk. I took a slow step toward the kitchen. Then I stopped. The floor was wet. A thin puddle stretched from the back door to the center of the room. The rest of the kitchen was completely dry. No leaks, no broken pipes, just that one perfect puddle, like someone had been standing there. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The lock was still in place. The door hadn't moved. Then, knock, 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 closer. I clenched my fists, my hands ice cold. I should have turned back. I should have walked away, but instead I stepped forward. My fingers hovered over the peephole. Don't look. The words slid into my mind like a whisper, but I ignored them. I pressed my eye to the glass. For a moment I saw nothing. Just the rain, the damp pavement outside, the flickering street lamp casting faint, distorted light into the alley. Then movement. a figure stepped into view. Tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and wrong, as if someone had stretched them just a little too far. It stopped right in front of the door, and then it looked up, and it smiled. Not a normal smile, not one that belonged to anything human. It was too wide, too stretched. The corners of its mouth curled up too far, as though something inside was pulling it open from within. And its eyes weren't there, just deep, hollow sockets, empty yet somehow staring straight at me. I stumbled back, my foot slipping in the puddle, sending me crashing against the counter. My breath came in ragged gasps, my fingers fumbling for my phone. Knock, 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 louder now, more urgent. It knew I had seen it. I scrambled to unlock my phone, shaking fingers struggling to dial. Then, click, the sound stopped me cold. I turned. The lock on the back door was turning, slowly, carefully, like whoever or whatever was on the other side knew I was watching. The rain outside suddenly stopped. The apartment fell into perfect, unnatural silence. Then, a voice, low, wet, right against the door. I see you. The lights flickered. Then, everything went black. Darkness swallowed the apartment. The sudden loss of light felt wrong, like something had snuffed it out rather than a simple power failure. The storm outside had vanished too, leaving only a dead, suffocating silence. It was as if the entire world had stopped. For a few agonizing seconds, I stood there, paralyzed, straining to hear anything. The hum of the refrigerator, the wind outside, the distant sound of cars on wet pavement. But there was nothing. Then, tap, a slow, wet footstep against the kitchen floor. Then another, tap. It was inside. I felt the air shift, a heavy dampness pressing against my skin, thick and suffocating. A rancid, earthy stench filled my nostrils. Something wet, something decayed. And then, through the silence, came a whisper. You let me in. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My fingers gripped the edge of the counter so tightly they ached. I didn't let it in. I locked the door. Didn't I? My hand trembled as I fumbled for my phone, the glow of the screen casting a weak, bluish light through the room. The back door was open, not just unlocked, wide open. The darkness beyond it was absolute, stretching into the alley like an open mouth. And in that doorway, something moved. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. Something was crouched there, just outside the threshold. It was wrong. Its limbs were bent at unnatural angles, folded in ways that no human body should be able to bend. The air around it seemed to vibrate, like static humming just beneath the surface of reality. Then, in a sickening, fluid motion, it crawled forward. I barely had time to react before the door slammed open, the force rattling the entire apartment. My phone slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor as I stumbled backward, heart hammering against my ribs. Heavy footsteps, wet, unmistakable. Inside, I scrambled back, barely able to think beyond the pure, animal panic flooding my system. My hands flailed blindly for anything to defend myself, fingers closing around a ceramic mug on the counter. I hurled it toward the figure. The shatter was deafening in the silence. For a split second, in the fractured light, I saw it clearly. It wasn't human. The two long arms, the stretched, glistening skin, the grotesque grin. It was as if someone had tried to sculpt a person from wax, then left it too close to a flame. But the worst part? It was closer. I had seen it near the door. Now, in the span of a heartbeat, it was inches away. The lights flickered. Every time they flashed back on, it had moved. Closer. Closer, closer, like it was skipping through time, jerking forward in impossible, unnatural increments. I threw myself toward the hallway, sprinting toward the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, slick with sweat, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind me, knock, knock, knock. It wasn't at the door anymore. It was inside. I yanked the door open, desperate to escape, but I didn't make it. Something cold curled around my wrist, yanking me backward with inhuman strength. My vision blurred. my body jerking violently as the world twisted around me. I crashed onto the floor, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. My fingers scraped against the hardwood, nails bending painfully as I tried to crawl away. Then my phone vibrated. The screen glowed in the dark, casting faint light over the room. A message from my own number. I stared at it, my body locked in place, my breath frozen in my throat. The message was just 3 words. Look behind you. I felt a shudder crawl up my spine. I didn't want to look. I knew what would be there. Then, another message. Why aren't you looking, Jake? My stomach twisted into knots. My skin felt too tight, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Slowly, shaking, I turned my head. In the dim glow of my phone screen, I saw it. A reflection, but it wasn't mine. It was something standing behind me, close, too close. It was watching me, grinning, waiting. The last thing I felt before the world went black was cold fingers pressing against my throat. I woke with a sharp gasp, lungs burning like I just surfaced from drowning. My body ached, and there was a dull, throbbing pain around my throat as if something had been gripping it. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. I was still in my apartment, but something was off. The air felt heavier, damp, thick with the lingering scent of wet earth and something rotten. My furniture had been shifted, subtle changes, a chair moved slightly, the rug no longer lined up with the floorboards, the kitchen cabinets left ajar. It was like someone had been here. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers. The screen flickered to life. 3:05 a.m. The same time. Again, my throat tightened. The events of the past hour, the knocking, the reflection, the thing standing behind me, they couldn't have been real. Could they? I turned to the back door. Still closed. Locked. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. Something had come through. I forced myself up, my legs weak beneath me. My body screamed to leave, to run, and never look back. But I needed answers. I grabbed my laptop, hands unsteady as I typed in my apartment address. At first, there was nothing. Just old property records, tenant complaints about the heating, minor maintenance issues. Then I found an article. Man disappears from apartment, no signs of forced entry. The date 2015. The details made my stomach twist. A man in his late 20s, living in this very unit, reported strange knocking sounds for weeks before he vanished. His neighbors had mentioned him acting paranoid, installing cameras near the back door. The last footage captured? The back door unlocking. And then static. I kept digging. Another case, 1989. A woman found dead in her kitchen, her face frozen in a twisted grin. Police found no signs of a break-in. No fingerprints. Nothing missing. Just water pulled near the back door. And one final entry. 1972. A child. A 10-year-old boy. His parents reported him sleepwalking during a blizzard, mumbling about someone knocking at the back door. The next morning, he was gone. His footprints led outside and stopped, right in the middle of the alley, like he had been taken. I shut the laptop, my breath coming fast and shallow. This wasn't coincidence. This thing, whatever it was, had always been here. And now it had chosen me. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air, thick, pressing against my skin. A heavy stillness settled around me. Then, knock, knock, knock. A shudder rolled down my spine. The back door. I turned, pulse hammering. A shadow shifted beneath the doorframe. The handle twitched, and I realized it wasn't done with me yet. Knock, knock, knock. The sound reverberated through the apartment, deliberate, steady, filled with a weight that sent a shudder down my spine. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't like before. This time, it wasn't asking for permission. It wasn't waiting. The air in the room turned thick, suffocating, pressing against my chest like something unseen was wrapping around me. The overhead lights flickered wildly, casting jagged, shifting shadows along the walls. And then, the back door handle began to turn. Not in the frantic, erratic way of someone desperately trying to break in. No, this was slow, deliberate, like it knew it had already won. Click. The first lock gave way. Click. The second one followed. I couldn't move. My body felt rooted to the floor, trapped between the primal instinct to run and the horrifying knowledge that there was nowhere to go. The door swung open. A gust of damp, foul-smelling air rushed into the apartment, carrying the stench of decay and wet earth. The alley beyond was swallowed in an unnatural blackness as if the rain had erased the world outside. Then, it stepped in. A tall, skeletal silhouette, its limbs stretched and wrong, dripping as if it had been standing in the rain for days. Its skin, pale and slick, glistened under the flickering light. And that smile. Too wide. Too knowing. It didn't walk. It flickered. One moment it stood at the doorway. Then it was halfway across the kitchen. Then closer. I sucked in a sharp breath, my body jolting into motion at last. I stumbled backward, crashing into the counter, my fingers scrambling for anything I could use to defend myself. But there was nothing. Nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. Then, my phone vibrated in my hand. A message. From my own number. Don't move. It sees better when you run. I barely had time to process the words before. The lights went out. The darkness was total, pressing in on me like something alive. And then, I felt it. The presence towering over me. The wet, ragged sound of something breathing, close enough that the air around me cooled. And then, a voice. Low. Thick. Right in my ear. You let me in, Jake. A sharp, freezing pressure clamped around my wrist. And then, I was dragged into the dark. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt thick, pressing in on me from all sides. Cold fingers still gripped my wrist, the sensation burning into my skin like frostbite. My body wasn't moving on its own. I was being dragged, pulled through a space that didn't exist, where the world around me felt like it was folding inward. And then, I was dropped. I hit the ground hard, my hands sinking into something wet and cold. The air was dense with the scent of damp earth and decay. My chest heaved as I tried to regain my bearings. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The space around me was wrong. A heavy fog stretched endlessly in every direction, curling around me like fingers. The sky above was a void, no stars, no moon, no light. Just darkness stretching into nothingness. I turned, trying to orient myself, but there was nothing. No buildings. No streets. Just an endless, empty wasteland. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound made my blood run cold. I turned my head slowly, and there, standing alone in the fog, was a door. A single, weathered wooden door. No walls. No frame. Just the door itself, standing upright, leading nowhere. But something was behind it. I could feel it. And it was knocking. Knock. 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 Louder this time. The wood trembled under the force. The sound reverberated through the ground, through my bones, through whatever this place was. I took a step back, my breath shallow. I wasn't the first one here. I wasn't the only one. This had happened before. The knocking grew more frantic. The door shook as if whatever was behind it was about to break through. I felt something in my pocket. My phone. With trembling hands, I pulled it out. The screen was still on, the dim glow barely cutting through the fog. A message. From my own number. Run. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, blindly, desperately, into the fog, my legs numb, my lungs burning. The knocking behind me grew deafening, like the entire world was shaking with it. Then, the door creaked open, and I knew without turning around that if I looked, I wouldn't get away. I ran faster. The mist closed in around me, swallowing me whole. And then, everything went black. What happened to Jake? Did he escape? Or is he still running, lost in whatever is on the other side of that door? Some warnings exist for a reason. Some doors should never be opened. And if you ever hear knocking in the middle of the night, don't answer it. Because once something gets in, you may never get it out.